I need you to stop whatever you're doing right now and pay attention. Oil just hit $89 a barrel. 150 ships are stranded at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz right now, not yesterday, right now, waiting. Because the moment they move, they get hit. At least 5 tankers already have been. 2 crew members are dead. And 20% of the world's oil supply is sitting on the wrong side of a waterway that is effectively closed. That is not a supply disruption. That is a shutdown. And what I am going to show you in this video is that the economic consequences of that shutdown are moving through the global system right now, in real time, and most people have absolutely no idea what is coming next. This is not about the war, the missiles, the diplomacy, the body count. That is the surface. Underneath it, there's a financial mechanism running that is going to determine your energy bill, your grocery prices, and your interest rate for the next 1 to 2 years. And I am going to show you exactly how it works, who already knows, and what the numbers that governments are not putting in headlines actually mean. Stay until the end. Because at the end of this video, I'm going to show you the 4 signals that will tell you when this is actually resolving. Not when politicians say it is resolving. The real signals, in the data, and nobody else is laying them out this clearly. Before I get into the mechanics, I owe you something. I owe you the truth about what the market got completely wrong going into this. For years, every analyst, every strategist, every fund manager said the same thing every time Iran threatened the Strait of Hormuz. They said, they will never actually do it. It would be economic suicide. Iran needs those shipping lanes almost as much as everyone else does. The mutual destruction is too great. It is priced in. Move on. I want you to remember that consensus. Because on February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel struck Iran. The supreme leader was killed on day 1, and within 72 hours, Iran broadcast a message on international maritime distress frequencies, the channel every ship in the region monitors, and said, "The strait is closed. If anyone tries to pass, we will set those ships ablaze." Then they mined the waterway, then they hit 5 tankers, and 150 ships anchored and stopped. The thing that was supposed to never happen happened, in 3 days. And here is why that matters more than the war itself. Every price, every forecast, every financial model in the world was built on the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz stays open. That assumption is now gone. And the repricing of a world without that assumption is what you are watching right now. Not just in oil, in everything. Let me explain why the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important 21 miles of water on the planet. Think of the global oil system as a circulatory system. The heart is the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar. Together they hold nearly half the world's proven oil reserves. And all of that oil has to leave through one artery. That artery is the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war started, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil passed through that strait every single day. That represents 20% of all the petroleum consumed on Earth, plus 22% of global liquefied natural gas trade every day, like clockwork. Think about that for a second. 1 in 5 barrels of oil that the world burns every day passes through a waterway that is 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. And that waterway is bordered on one side by a country that is currently at war with the United States. Now here is the part that most media is not explaining clearly. The strait has not been physically blocked. Technically, ships can still enter, but they won't. According to data from the vessel tracking firm Kepler, since the war started, commercial operators, major oil companies, and marine insurers have effectively withdrawn from the corridor. Insurance premiums have reached 6-year highs. Most operators decided the crossing was economically unviable, or simply too dangerous. At least 5 tankers have already been hit, 2 crew members killed, about 150 ships are stranded, anchored in open waters at the edge of the strait, waiting for conditions that may not come. The result is what analysts are calling a de facto closure. It produces the same outcome as a physical blockade without requiring Iran to fire a single additional shot. Now layer on top of this the following. Qatar, the world's 3rd largest LNG exporter, halted gas production after Iranian drones attacked its facilities. Saudi Arabia's largest refinery was targeted. Iraq and Kuwait have already begun shutting in production because they cannot export their crude through the strait. According to Rapidan Energy, a consulting firm, this is already the biggest oil supply disruption in history. Not the biggest threat of disruption, the biggest actual disruption. And the world is running on reserve tanks. Let me show you exactly what happened to prices, and why what you are seeing today is not the good news it looks like. Before the war started, Brent crude was trading around $70 a barrel. Normal, calm, priced for a stable world. Within days of the strikes on Iran, Brent surged above $103. By the time Iranian attacks on tankers became systematic and the de facto closure set in, it briefly topped $119 per barrel, the highest level since 2008. That is a 70% price increase in under 2 weeks. Today, as I am recording this, Brent is trading around $89 a barrel. And I know what some of you are thinking. It came down from 119. Maybe the worst is over. Maybe the market is pricing in a resolution. I want to be very direct with you about why that thinking is dangerous. The price came down because G7 governments announced a potential coordinated release of emergency oil reserves, up to 400 million barrels, and that headline alone was enough to push prices lower. That is not a fundamental improvement. That is a market reacting to a political announcement. The strait is still closed. The tankers are still stranded. The supply disruption has not changed by a single barrel. What changed is that governments said words that the market wanted to hear. And I am going to show you in the next section exactly why those words are not going to be enough. But first, let me show you what even the current price of $89 is already doing in the real world. Because 89 is not 70, and the distance between those two numbers is already transmitting through every economy on the planet. In the United States, gasoline prices crossed $4 per gallon, the highest since 2023. In Europe, natural gas prices nearly doubled in a matter of days, because 30% of Europe's jet fuel and a significant share of its LNG come from or transit through the strait. South Korea, which imports 20% of its gas from the Gulf region, reported it could run out of LNG in 9 days. Their president announced a $68 billion stabilization fund in 9 days. Now here's the part that connects energy prices to your economy, and I need you to understand this because most people miss it completely. Oil is not just what goes in your car. Oil is fertilizer. Oil is plastics. Oil is shipping costs. Oil is the price of every single product that moves from a factory to a store to your home. When oil goes up from 70 to 89 and stays there, inflation does not stay at 2.4%. When it stays elevated and the strait stays closed, central banks lose the ability to cut interest rates to support a slowing economy. Because cutting rates with inflation reaccelerating is the definition of pouring gasoline on a fire. The price going from 119 to 89 is not a recovery. It is a pause. The trap was set the moment the strait closed, and the world is still inside it. Now let me show you what governments are doing about this and why it is not going to work. On March 10th, the International Energy Agency called an extraordinary meeting, the first of its kind in years. Executive Director Fatih Birol warned that conditions in oil markets had deteriorated in recent days, and that significant and growing risks existed for the global market. The G7 nations, the United States, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Canada, held emergency calls to discuss a coordinated release of emergency oil stockpiles. The proposal on the table, according to the Wall Street Journal, releasing somewhere between 300 and 400 million barrels, the largest emergency reserve release in the history of the IEA. Now here's what they are not telling you alongside that headline. Global oil consumption runs at approximately 100 million barrels per day. The Strait of Hormuz disruption is cutting off around 20 million barrels per day of export capacity. A 400 million barrel release sounds enormous. It is 20 days of the disrupted volume, at most. And according to analysis from the G7's own advisors, a release of this scale takes 2 to 4 weeks to physically begin reaching refineries in meaningful quantities. The oil has to be drawn from storage. It has to move through pipelines. It has to reach the refineries that can process it. So the largest emergency oil reserve release in human history buys approximately 20 days of coverage. It does not end the disruption. It does not reopen the strait. It does not stop the war. It is the financial equivalent of a painkiller while the surgery is still happening. And here is the math. Nobody's running publicly. Even if OPEC nations with spare capacity, primarily Saudi Arabia and the UAE, wanted to increase output to compensate, that spare capacity sits on the other side of the closed strait. It cannot reach global markets if the waterway remains inaccessible. The alternative pipelines, Saudi Aramco's East-West pipeline and the UAE's Habshan Fujairah pipeline, have a combined capacity of roughly 4.7 million barrels per day. The disruption is approximately 20 million barrels per day. The math does not work. Every government statement in the last week has been designed to calm the market, not to solve the problem. And the market is slowly starting to understand the difference. Now, let me show you the pattern, because this has happened before. Not exactly like this, but close enough that the economic logic holds every single time. 1973, the Arab oil embargo. OPEC cut production and blocked sales to the United States and Western Europe after the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled. Within 2 years, the United States was in a recession. Inflation hit double digits. The Federal Reserve was forced to raise interest rates to levels that made borrowing for businesses and homeowners economically devastating. Stagflation, high inflation, coexisting with economic stagnation, became the defining economic story of the decade. That disruption cut approximately 7% of global oil supply. The current disruption to export capacity through the Strait of Hormuz represents approximately 20% of world petroleum consumption. nearly 3 times the scale of the event that defined the worst economic decade of the 20th century. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Iran's oil production dropped by 4 to 5 million barrels per day. Oil prices doubled. The United States economy contracted. Unemployment rose. The Fed, under Paul Volcker, raised interest rates to 20% to crush the inflation that the oil shock had triggered. It worked, but it caused one of the deepest recessions in post-war history as the cost of doing it. 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Oil prices surged 70% in 3 months. The United States and coalition forces went to war. Oil prices fell back as Kuwait was liberated, but the price shock still contributed to the recession of 1990 and 1991. Every single time. The pattern is the same. Oil supply shock, inflation surge, growth compression. Central banks forced to choose between fighting inflation and supporting growth, and ordinary people paying the bill through higher prices, higher interest rates, and slower wage growth. Now, here's what is different this time. In 1973, the global economy was not carrying the debt load it carries today. In 1979, central banks had room to raise rates aggressively because baseline rates were low enough to have runway. In 1990, the disruption lasted months, not years. Today, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank were already planning rate cuts in 2026, based on the assumption that inflation was finally under control. Former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen has already warned that depending on the war's impact on oil markets, the Fed's ability to contain inflation will become significantly more difficult. The chances of a U.S. recession in 2026, according to Polymarket, a prediction market, have already risen to 41%. That number was in the low teens before February 28th. One oil shock, 12 days, recession probability more than doubled. The people in 1973 who understood what an oil shock meant for inflation were the ones who protected their purchasing power. The people who thought it was a geopolitical event that would blow over were the ones who got hit hardest. The question is not whether this creates economic pain. It already is. Prices are already up. Supply is already disrupted. The question is how long it lasts. And that answer depends entirely on whether the Strait of Hormuz reopens. Not in days. Not because governments say it will. In reality, with ships moving again, that has not happened. And according to ExxonMobil's chief economist, Tyler Goodspeed, speaking to CNBC, there are many more probable scenarios in which the strait remains closed harder and for longer than there are scenarios in which normal traffic resumes. Let me be clear about what I am not saying. I'm not saying this is the end of the global economy. I'm not saying you should panic. I'm not saying inflation will hit double digits by summer. What I am saying is this. Every major oil shock in history has created a window, a period of weeks or months between when the shock happens and when its full effects reach your daily life. Supply chains take time to transmit price increases. Central banks take quarters to respond. Recessions take time to be officially declared. Right now, you are inside that window. The shock has happened. The transmission is underway. And the people who understand the mechanics have a window of time to think clearly while others are still processing the headlines. Here's what to watch. These are the 4 signals that matter. First, the Strait of Hormuz traffic data, not government statements, actual vessel tracking. Kay Peeler publishes this. Lloyd's List publishes this. When ships start moving again, in real numbers, not in diplomatic language, that is the signal the worst is passing. Second, insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Gulf. When those premiums come back down to operational levels, commercial operators will return. Right now, they are at 6-year highs. Watch the direction of that number every week. Third, whether the IEA reserve release actually lands in the physical market. The proposal is to release up to 400 million barrels, but those barrels take weeks to move. Watch the EIA weekly inventory data. Watch whether U.S. gasoline prices stabilize or continue climbing. Fourth, the Federal Reserve's language on interest rates. If they shift from rate cuts are coming to we need to wait and see, that is the Fed pricing in stagflation risk. That language shift is the canary in the coal mine for the broader economy. None of these signals are flashing green right now. The strait is not open. Insurance premiums are not falling. The reserves have not reached the market. The Fed is not relaxed. Understanding the difference between where we are right now and where we need to be before this resolves is the most important thing I can give you today. This war has broken something in the assumption structure that has governed global energy markets for 50 years. The assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would always remain open, that no actor would ever actually weaponize it completely, that the mutual economic destruction was too great. That assumption is gone now. Even after the war ends, tanker insurance will carry a new permanent premium. Energy importers in Asia will begin diversifying routes and reserves. European governments will accelerate energy independence. None of these structural changes unwind quickly. The world that exists after this conflict closes is going to have a different floor price for oil than the world that existed before February 28th. And that floor price has direct consequences for inflation, for interest rates, and for economic growth for years, not months. Drop a comment. Tell me where you think oil ends up if the strait stays closed for another 30 days. Tell me whether you think the IEA reserve release is going to be enough, or whether you think we're looking at the early stages of something much larger. I want to hear your analysis. I will pin the most thoughtful response. Share this video right now, because there are people in your life who are watching their energy bills go up, watching their groceries get more expensive, watching the news about missiles and diplomacy, and they do not understand the mechanism connecting those things. This video is that mechanism. Help them understand it. If you are new here, this is what we do. We do not chase headlines. We decode the hidden economy, the layer underneath the news that determines how wealth is actually transferred, and how ordinary people can navigate it with clarity instead of fear. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, because the next moves in this story are going to happen fast. And the gap between those who understand the mechanics and those who do not is going to widen every single week that this war continues. This is Finance Deciphered. The war nobody was ready for has already started breaking the economy. Nobody was watching. Stay sharp.